where silence ruled the mountains, she thought she was utterly alone, until the cry of a buried child broke through the snow. 100 warriors encircled her cabin, their torches burning in the storm. Yet inside she sat steady, a rifle in her lap and a child in her arms. The mountains had a way of swallowing sound, especially in the depth of winter. Snow lay heavy on the ridges, pressed into the ravines, blanketing the valley in a silence so complete that even the crows had abandoned their calls. Eliza Harrow sat alone in her cabin, a shawl pulled across her shoulders, the rocking chair creaking slow against the plank floor. The fire muttered low in the hearth, sparks lifting like brief stars before vanishing into the chimney. Outside, the storm had rolled down from the high passes, sifting the world white. Eliza had lived alone for 3 winters since her husband Daniel went to his grave. The years before had hollowed her further. One child lost to fever, another stillborn on a night much like this one. A woman could grow used to silence, she told herself, could grow used to coffee gone cold, to the rhythm of splitting wood, to the rifle that leaned near the door like a sentry against the unknown. She thought herself accustomed to the emptiness until she heard it, a thin cry, almost swallowed by the wind. At first she believed it was memory, the cruel kind that played tricks when nights grew long. But then it came again, faint, desperate, alive. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter and stepped outside. Snow bit at her face, the wind clawing at her breath. She trudged toward the pines where the sound carried, boots sinking deep with each step. There, half buried beneath a drift, lay a bundle wrapped in a torn, frost-stiff shawl. The cloth was ragged, its once bright pattern dulled with ice. Inside, an infant twisted weakly, his cheeks raw with cold, his cry no louder than a bird caught in briar. For a long moment she simply stared. The valley had been empty for months. No wagon tracks, no travelers, no neighbors nearer than a day's ride. To find a child in the snow seemed no act of chance. Her hand shook as she brushed powder. From the small face, against all reason the baby still breathed. She lifted him, pressing him against her chest, and hurried back to the cabin, boots breaking through the crust of ice. Inside, the fire threw its fragile warmth. She set the infant near the hearth, stripping the stiff shawl and wrapping him instead in one of her wool blankets. His skin was cold as river stone, but his tiny fists flexed, clinging to the air. Eliza poured water into a tin cup, setting it by the coals, and searched her shelves. Goat's milk, kept in a clay jug, would have to do. She warmed it slowly, careful not to scald. As she worked, her mind tripped back to the daughter she once cradled in this same shawl, her breath quick, her eyes bright, before fever took her. She could almost smell the same sweetness of milk on the air, could almost hear the lullabies Daniel used to hum. When the child finally fed, slow and greedy, a strange heat filled her chest. Not the fire's warmth, but something long buried. She whispered a name aloud, Isaiah, though she did not know why that name came to her. Perhaps from scripture remembered, perhaps from the old hymn her mother sang when she was young. Isaiah slept in her arms, breath small but steady. His hair was dark as the bark of pine after rain, his eyelids thin as paper. Eliza traced the line of his cheek, then looked toward the door. The rifle leaned there, the barrel catching the glow of firelight. She could not shake the sense that the valley's silence was not empty but watchful, as if eyes studied her from beyond the drifts. She laid the child in a basket lined with wool and sat once more in her rocking chair, though the stillness no longer felt the same. The creak of wood kept time with her thoughts. The snow outside whispered against the windows. She knew nothing of the infant's kin, nothing of why he had been left beneath the pines, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her world had shifted. For years she had lived waiting for each season to pass, waiting for nothing. But now something small and frail had been placed into her keeping. Whether it was blessing or curse, she could not yet tell. Still, as the fire dimmed to embers and the storm pressed close, Eliza Harrow felt the first fragile spark of hope flare within the ashes of her grief. The storm passed, leaving the valley hushed beneath a sky the color of pewter. Days folded into one another, marked not by company or conversation, but by the needs of the child. Eliza learned again the rhythms she thought had died with her own. Children, warming goat's milk over the fire, melting snow into water, testing its heat against her wrist before pressing it to tiny lips. Isaiah fed slowly, sometimes too weak to drink, and she would sing to coax him. Songs half forgotten rose from her throat like smoke, old hymns her mother once carried through the cornfields back east. Her voice trembled at first, cracked from disuse, but soon steadied. The infant stilled when she sang, his eyes closing, his breath deepening. The cabin, once silent but for the groan of logs in frost, now held the fragile sound of lullabies and the even softer sigh of a sleeping child. Her shawl carried a permanent scent of smoke and pine pitch. She wrapped Isaiah close against her chest, the warmth of his body sinking through wool and into her bones. At night, the wind rattled the shutters, and she listened for his breathing more than she listened for wolves or storms. It was on the fourth morning that she found the tracks. Near the tree line where the snow lay crusted and unbroken, shapes marked the white, shallow prints, narrow at the heel, wide at the toe. Not boots, moccasins. She crouched low, brushing frost from the edges, her breath misting above them. The prints moved parallel to the ridge, pausing as though whoever made them had stood watching the cabin. A shiver tightened her shoulders. She rose slowly, scanning the timberline, but the pines revealed nothing save their own long shadows. Still, the silence felt heavier, filled with unseen breath. That evening, she kept the rifle across her lap as she sat in her rocking chair. Isaiah slept near the fire, swaddled in wool. She thought of Daniel, his voice deep as the river, telling her once that mercy and violence were neighbors on this frontier, never far apart. A man might carry kindness in his chest and still strike with the tomahawk before the hour turned. Eliza wondered now whether the eyes in the timber carried one or the other, or both. When the baby stirred, she set the rifle aside and lifted him, cradling his head in the crook of her arm. His skin was warmer now, the faintest blush of health showing at his cheeks. He pressed his hand against her neck, and for the first time in years she felt the tremor in her fingers still. They no longer shook as they had when she lit the lamps or drew water from the well. Later, as the cabin filled, with the scent of burning spruce, Eliza sat before the small mirror nailed to the wall. She undid her hair, long and silvering, and braided it slow by firelight. The motion was steady, purposeful, a tether to something she thought she had lost. She studied her own reflection, the scar at her temple from a fall off a horse in her youth, the lines carved deep by grief and cold. Yet in her eyes there was something she scarcely recognized. Resolve. The valley was changing. She felt it in the wind that carried strange whispers through the eaves. Somewhere beyond the ridge riders moved. She could hear them faintly when the world was still enough, the distant clop of hooves swallowed quick by snow. They were not settlers, not soldiers. She knew whose tracks those were, and the thought set her jaw firm. Isaiah slept on, oblivious. His breath was a rhythm, fragile but certain, like a prayer repeated against despair. Eliza leaned back in the rocker, shawl drawn close, and let the weight of the child anchor her to the present. She could not know what fate approached from the tree line. Only that danger thickened around her cabin like the sky before a storm. And yet, beneath that gathering unease, there grew a quiet truth she could not deny. This child, left in snow as if to perish, had become her reason to rise, to braid her hair with steady hands, to move with purpose once more. The silence of the valley was no longer only a burden. It was a space in which she could hear the fragile drumbeat of life begin again. By the sixth morning, the air carried a strange heaviness, as though the mountains themselves held their breath. Eliza stepped outside to draw water from the half-buried barrel and saw a column of smoke lifting from the far ridge. It smudged, the pale sky like a warning written in ash. She stood long in the snow, her hands bare, the cold biting at her knuckles. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant men. At first she told herself it might be hunters, a family wandering late from the trail. But her heart knew otherwise. This was no stray campfire. This was signal. By midday she spotted them, small figures cresting the white ridge, then more and still more behind. Riders in silence, their silhouettes black against the snowfields, moving with the patience of wolves. A dozen, then 24. By the time she counted near 50, she ceased trying. There were more than she could reckon, spread across the horizon, their horses sending up a mist of frost. 100, perhaps. Enough to swallow her cabin whole. Eliza turned back inside. The baby lay near the hearth, swaddled in wool, his breath shallow but steady. She touched his brow, then crossed the room to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside lay her wedding dress, folded with care though yellowed by years, lace frayed at the edges, silk dulled to cream. It still carried the faintest scent of lavender sachet. She let her hand rest on it. That dress had once meant promise, union, a life shared with Daniel beneath God's witness. Now it was only cloth, a memory of vows broken not by choice but by violence, by time's cruelty. She closed the chest. Duty called her elsewhere. She fetched her husband's old axe, edge dulled from seasons of woodcutting. With steady hands she set to the whetstone, drawing steel against stone in slow, even strokes. The sound rasped through the cabin like breath. Beside it lay the rifle, barrel tarnished, stock worn smooth where Daniel's hand had once held it. She cleaned and oiled it, each motion deliberate. There was comfort in preparation, even if preparation promised no salvation. Through the window, she could see the riders drawing nearer. Their line curved wide across the valley, dark forms threading through the snow. She knew the cabin could not withstand them. The logs were stout but not fortress. The shutters rattled in mere winter winds. They would shatter under arrows or torch. She might kill 1, 2, perhaps a handful. But against 100? The thought was almost laughable, and yet she did not laugh. She worked because work was all that remained to her. The shadows lengthened as afternoon waned. By the hearth, Isaiah stirred, his small cry filling the cabin. Eliza lifted him, pressed him close to her chest. His warmth steadied her heart. She hushed him with a hum, then laid him back in his basket, tucking wool firm around his chin. He was unaware of the storm pressing near, a storm of hooves and breath and sharpened steel. Eliza sat at last in her rocking chair. The axe rested against the wall, the rifle across her knees. She stared into the fire, watching embers collapse, remembering nights when Daniel sat opposite, his boots crossed at the ankle, speaking low about how a woman might survive in a land that offered no mercy. She realized she had already answered that question. Survival was no longer hers alone to seek. It was the child's breath she guarded now, however brief it might prove. The valley might demand her life before the next dawn, but she would not let it take him without her stand. Outside, the hoofbeats rolled closer, muffled by snow yet heavy as thunder beneath the earth. The sound grew steady, a storm drawing its circle around her world. Shadows stretched long across the drifts, slipping through the pines, climbing toward her cabin walls. She could see them from the window, figures swaying with their mounts, torches held high, faces hidden beneath braids and feathers. Eliza drew in a slow breath, feeling the shawl against her shoulders, smelling the smoke and pine pitch that clung to her clothes. The day dimmed, the fire crackled. Isaiah slept. The circle was closing, and she, bound by grief and by newfound duty, set her jaw against inevitability, waiting for the night to decide whether it would bring death or some other. Fate yet unnamed, night fell with a swiftness that startled her. One moment the sky still held the last pale bands of twilight, the next it was swallowed whole by blackness. Clouds thickened, smothering the moon, and snow began to fall again. Fine, dry flakes that hissed against the cabin roof. They came with the dark. First the sound of hooves in the distance, muffled and steady, then the glimmer of fire weaving through the timberline. Torches, dozens of them, spread wide until they circled the cabin like a crown of flame in the storm. The riders dismounted, their shadows wavering across the drifts. Eliza watched through the cracks in the shutters as the ring closed. 100. Strong, silent save for the creak of leather and the stamp of restless horses. Her heart pounded, but her face was still. She took her place in the rocking chair, rifle laid across her lap, the infant nestled against her chest beneath her shawl. His small warmth pressed into her ribs, reminding her with every breath why she remained seated and waiting. The fire popped in the hearth. Shadows danced across the log walls. She braced herself for arrows. She imagined them piercing through, the planks, sharp and sudden. She imagined torches hurled, flames licking upward, roof collapsing. She could see her own death with such clarity that it no longer terrified her. Fear had burned itself out in the long years of loss, leaving only a strange stillness, yet the assault never came. Instead, a sound rose from beyond the walls, a low chant, voices woven together carried by the wind. It was not war cry but song, heavy with age, as if the earth itself had joined the chorus. The melody circled her as the warriors did, rising and falling, foreign yet strangely familiar in its rhythm. Eliza closed her eyes. The song pulled her into memory. She saw Daniel's smile, quick and crooked, as he returned from the hunt with a brace of quail. She heard her daughter's laughter echoing through this same cabin years ago, her small feet thumping against the planks. She saw herself in a white dress once, lace brushing the floor, eyes bright with a future that never came. Grief pressed sharp as glass against her chest. Yet beneath it was something else. An ache no longer hollow, but filled with the weight of what she still held. Isaiah stirred in her arms. His hand, no bigger than a sparrow's wing, found her finger and clutched it tight. The grip was weak, but insistent. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, though none fell. That small grasp felt stronger than any oath, stronger than the rifle across her knees. The chant outside deepened, rising with the storm's wind. Torches hissed in the falling snow. The warriors did not speak in anger, did not rush the walls. They sang. She wondered if they sang for the child, or for the dead, or for the long night itself. She would never know. Eliza rocked slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. The rifle's weight grew less important in her lap, as though the weapon belonged to an earlier chapter of her life. She realized she was no longer waiting to fight nor even waiting to survive. She was waiting with a kind of dignity, prepared to meet whatever end came. Her fear transformed into quiet surrender. Hours stretched. The fire sank low, shadows thickening across the walls. Still the chant went on. She dozed in fragments, waking at each gust of wind, each stir of the child. Outside, the circle of warriors held, their torches glowing like a halo in the dark. Toward dawn, the chant faded. Silence fell again, deeper than before. Eliza lifted her head from where it had slumped against the chair, her body stiff, her shawl damp with the child's warmth. She realized she had not died. The cabin still stood. The infant still breathed. Fear had become something else entirely. Acceptance, and with it, a fragile kind of peace. Dawn came pale and cold, the light struggling through a veil of snow. Eliza woke stiff in her chair, shawl heavy across her shoulders, the infant curled warm against her chest. For a moment she thought the night had been dream, the chanting no, more than the echoes of memory. Then she rose and peered through the shutter. The circle still held. Warriors stood in silence, torches burned low, smoke rising thin as ghosts. Horses pawed the ground, their breath silver against the morning air. From the ring, a single rider broke away. He moved slow, deliberate, across the drifts until his mount stood just paces from the cabin. The man dismounted with care, his braids, streaked with gray, his eyes carved deep, solemn as weathered stone. He wore no war paint, no mask of fury, only the weight of age and the steadiness of one who had seen too much. Eliza set Isaiah gently into his basket, then took the rifle in her hands. She did not raise it, but neither did she set it aside. Her Heart thudded in her ears as the elder stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance from the door. When he spoke, his voice carried not anger but recognition. His words were measured, his English broken yet clear enough. The child. He is ours. Blood of our people. Left in snow, after betrayal, after slaughter. His gaze drifted toward the basket by the fire, then back to her. We feared the whites would take him, raise him not knowing who he was. Eliza's grip on the rifle loosened. She felt her breath leave her chest in a long sigh. The warriors had not come to kill her. They had come to see who would shelter the child of their fallen kin. For a moment words failed her. She looked toward the basket, at the tiny bundle shifting in sleep. She thought of how she had found him beneath the pines, how his weak cry had pierced the storm. She thought of her own daughter's cry years ago, silenced by fever. Two griefs overlapped inside her, old and new, sharp and tender. Slowly she unwrapped the shawl that swaddled him, baring the infant's face to the pale morning light. His skin glowed soft against the wool, his dark hair matted from sleep. His small fist twitched, clutching at the air. The elder's eyes lingered on the child a long while. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the hearth and the muffled shifting of horses beyond. Snow drifted gently from the sky, settling on the man's shoulders, melting against his braids. Eliza stood rooted, the rifle heavy but unthreatening in her hands. Her breath clouded before her lips. She did not speak, for words seemed poor in the face of what had passed between them, her grief for the children she had lost, his grief for the people he still carried. At last, the elder bowed his head. It was not a gesture of defeat, nor of supplication, but of acknowledgement, of her mercy, of the strange bond that had formed across the gulf of loss. He turned then, remounting his horse with slow, deliberate grace. When he rejoined his people, the circle shifted. Torches were extinguished in the snow, smoke coiling upward before vanishing into the wind. One by one the warriors began to withdraw, their line unraveling across the valley, a great storm dispersing. Eliza watched until the last shadow melted into the timberline. Only then did she set the rifle aside and sink back into her chair. Her hands trembled as she reached for Isaiah. She pressed him close, listening to his breath steady and sure. The fire burned low, sending up threads of smoke that curled toward the rafters. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the emptiness of loss, but the pause after revelation. She understood now that the child was no accident, no stray life cast upon her doorstep. He was the remnant of another family, another story, and she had been chosen, if only for a season, to guard him. Snow drifted against the windows. Her heart, though heavy, felt unburdened in a way it had not in years. Two griefs had crossed in the pale light of dawn, and where they touched, something like understanding had been born. The valley was empty again. Where once the snow had glowed with firelight and the silhouettes of riders, now only the quiet remained. Eliza stood at the threshold of her cabin, Isaiah cradled in her arms, watching as the last of the warriors vanished into the pines. The elder had spoken no more words, only that solemn bow of his head before he turned away. Yet in that gesture she had felt something linger, a promise, unspoken but clear. They would remember. She waited a long while after they had gone, the snow falling in soft veils, muffling the world. It was as though the land itself sighed with relief. The storm had circled, but it had passed her by. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt no pressing weight of dread, no certainty that fate crouched just outside her door. Instead, she felt the strange hush of survival, the knowledge that she had met the night, looked into its face and found herself still breathing come morning. Inside, the fire still held a glow. She fed it with pine, then laid Isaiah near the hearth while she washed her face with melted snow. Her reflection in the basin startled her, hair silvered, skin lined, but her eyes, those had changed, no longer hollow, no longer dulled by years of grief. There was something steady in them now, sharpened by trial and softened by mercy. Winter lingered, as winter always does, but the days began to stretch longer. The sun reached higher each noon. Streams beneath the drifts stirred with restless water, cracking through their icy prisons. The sound carried faintly to her cabin, trickles and murmurs like whispers of a season yet to come. Eliza fell into new rhythms. She rose at dawn to split kindling. Isaiah bundled tight against her chest, his breath warming the wool shawl. She churned butter, her arms steady with work, humming low songs while the child gurgled at her back. She mended the fence where storms had broken rails, pausing often to lift her face to the wind, half expecting to see riders returning. None came. Only the call of crows, the occasional crack of ice surrendering to melt. When the snow finally broke, the earth showed itself dark and wet, rich with promise. She planted early seeds in her garden plot, potatoes, onions, hardy greens. Isaiah watched from his blanket, reaching for handfuls of soil with curious fingers. His laughter startled her the first time it came, a bright, bubbling sound that carried across the yard. For so long the cabin had known only silence and the moan of wind. Now it held a voice, small but insistent, as if life itself had chosen to root here again. At night she rocked him by the fire, steam rising from her tin cup of coffee. The shawl smelled of smoke, of pine, of milk spilled in haste. The rifle still leaned against the door, but she no longer glanced at it as often. Her hands, once quick to tremble, moved with calm purpose, folding linen, braiding her hair, tucking Isaiah into his basket. The cabin, once a tomb of memory, had become a home again, and yet the scars remained. There were mornings when she still reached across the bed, expecting Daniel's warmth. Evenings when she dreamed of her daughter's small hand in hers, only to wake to emptiness. Those losses would never fade, but they no longer defined her. They were threads in the fabric of her life, woven alongside new ones. Grief had not vanished. It had been joined by something else, something gentler. Isaiah grew stronger with each passing week. His cheeks filled out, his eyes brightened. His cry rang sharp and healthy. He began to kick his legs against the blanket, impatient with stillness. Eliza laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years when he startled himself with the sound of his own voice. She found herself whispering stories to him, tales of Daniel's hunting trips, of her mother's hymns, of summers back east when fireflies lit the night. He would not understand, not yet, but her words filled the silence, shaping it into belonging. The thaw came fully by mid-spring. The valley turned to mud and water, rivers surging with melt, fields greening at their edges. Birds returned, stitching the sky with their flight. Eliza worked long days to repair the roof where ice had bowed the beams. Isaiah bundled to her, back, his head lolling as he slept. She sang as she worked, her voice carrying across the land, no longer cracked with sorrow but tempered, clear. In the evenings, she sat once more in her rocking chair, the infant in her lap. The fire glowed warm, the cabin filled with the scent of coffee and pine. She often thought of that night when the warriors had circled, of the chant that had risen like thunder and yet had not struck her down. She thought of the elders' bowed head, the quiet acknowledgement between them. Mercy had bridged the gulf of grief. It had spared her, and in sparing her, it had given her this fragile life, this new beginning. Seasons would come, and with them hardship. She did not delude herself. The valley was still wild, still cruel when it wished to be, but she was not the same woman who had once sat waiting only for time to carry her toward the grave. She had something to guard, something to nurture. She had reason to rise each morning, reason to labor through the thaw, reason to keep the fire, burning long into the night. Endings, she had learned, were not always death. Sometimes they were doorways. Sometimes they carried the sound of a child's laugh, the weight of a small hand clutching her finger, the warmth of breath against her shawl. Eliza Harrow still bore her scars. She always would. But when she looked into Isaiah's eyes, she saw not only what had been lost, but what had been found, fragile, improbable, yet alive, And in the long thaw of the valley, as streams sang and fields stirred, she knew that life, stubborn as winter, would always find its way forward.